Good evening, and welcome back. If you are joining us for the first time, please settle in wherever you are. In bed with the lamp still burning, maybe, or curled somewhere dark, with your phone face down beside you and the window showing whatever the sky is doing tonight, in whatever city or village or middle of nowhere you happen to occupy. If you have been here before, then you already know the rhythm of how this goes. Drop your shoulders, let the day go, let the noise of it recede, the way noise recedes when you step from a crowded room into a corridor and the door closes behind you. The pressure equalizes, the world gets quieter. That is where we are going. Before we begin, I always like to take a moment here. Someone wrote to me last week from a fishing village on the coast of Crete, of all places, and said they listened while the boats came in, that they fell asleep before the ending and woke up with the sea smell still in the air and the story still half assembled in their mind. I don't know why that image has stayed with me. Something about the setting felt right for what we have tonight. The coast, the sea, the old business of water and distance, and what happens to men who listen when they should be rowing. Because tonight we are going deep into Greek myth. We are going to the story of the Sirens, and I want to be careful from the start about what I mean when I say that. The image that survives into popular imagination, the postcard image, the version on the coffee cups, is of beautiful women on rocks, singing, drawing sailors to their deaths. That much is technically accurate, but it is also the part that matters least. It is the surface of a story whose depth has been taking on water since before Homer wrote anything down, and if you only read the surface, you will miss the grief that is at the center of it, and the cosmology, and the question underneath the cosmology that is, in the end, the real reason this story has lasted 3,000 years and is being told to you right now in the dark. So let's go back. Let's go all the way back to before the Sirens were born, before the sea they haunted was mapped or named, before there were sailors to hear them. Back to the beginning, where all the Greek myths eventually have to go. The world, in the Greek telling, did not begin with silence. This is the part that the later stories tend to rush through in their eagerness to reach the drama. But it matters. It matters more than the drama, actually. And I am going to stay with it until it opens up the way certain rooms open when you stop trying to turn on the lights and let your eyes adjust instead. The Greeks called the original state of things chaos, but not in the sense we use that word now. Not disorder, not catastrophe. The word meant something closer to a gap, a vast, undifferentiated openness, a space that was neither something nor nothing, but the condition that made both possible, a held breath. The moment before a note is struck when the instrument is already in the air. From chaos came Gaia, the earth, arising from whatever primordial potential chaos contained. She did not wait for permission. She simply arrived, enormous and patient, the ground of everything that would follow. And alongside Gaia, or shortly after, came Eros, not the little winged archer of the later tradition, but the original cosmic force, the drive of connection and longing, the thing that makes one thing move toward another, and Erebus, the deep darkness, and Nyx, the night. The world was assembling its own vocabulary before there were any minds to read it. Gaia made the sky above herself, Uranus, starlit and vast, pressing down over her with his whole weight, which the myths treat as a kind of intimacy, and which I find it difficult to describe as simply that, though the texts require a certain careful distance here. From the union of Gaia and Uranus came the first children, the 12 Titans, enormous and archaic, older than order, 6 daughters and 6 sons, Oceanus, who became the river encircling the world, Kronos, the youngest, who would become the most important, Rhea, who would suffer most directly, Hyperion, Cois, Creus, Mnemosyne, Phoebe, Tethys, Themis, Eurydice, 12, and each one vast. After the Titans came others, stranger and harder to accommodate, the 3 Cyclopes, Brontes, Steropes, Arges, each with a single great burning eye in the center of their foreheads, not stupid as the later tradition would make them, but ancient and powerful, capable of forging things that ordinary creation could not produce. And then the 3 Hecatoncheires, Cottus, Briareus, Gyges, 50 heads each, 100 hands each, beings so immense and so strange that even the sky god who had fathered them was afraid of what he had made. Uranus pushed them back into the earth. He buried them inside Gaia's body, refusing to let them enter the world, and the pressure of them inside her was constant and painful and something she did not forgive. Mothers, the myths understand, remember. Gaia felt the weight of her buried children, and she felt something that the Greek texts gesture toward, but rarely name directly, a cold, purposeful fury, the kind that does not shout but plans. She shaped a great sickle from grey adamantine, and she called her children to her, and she asked which of them would do what needed to be done. The Titans looked at the sickle and at the task implied by its shape, and they were quiet. Only Kronos, the youngest, met her eyes. Only he said, "I will do it." He waited in the place where sky meets earth, crouching in that transitional darkness, the sickle hidden. When Uranus descended over Gaia in the night, Kronos reached up with the sickle and castrated his father in a single arcing motion, and the severed flesh was flung outward and fell into the sea. Where it landed, foam gathered. From the foam, from an act of violence in the dark, not from love, not from desire, but from mutilation, rose Aphrodite, the goddess of desire and beauty, already formed, already adult, already carrying within her the complex and somewhat alarming truth that the Greeks intuited about desire, that it is not clean, that it is not separate from pain, that its origin contains something that the later centuries have preferred not to look at directly. The blood from the wound fell on the earth and became the Erinyes, the Furies, who enforce oaths and avenge certain specific crimes, and who are relentless in the particular way that justice is relentless when it is not balanced by mercy. It also became the giants and the ash tree nymphs who would tend the world's wild places. The world was assembling itself out of violence and necessity, and what it made from violence was, often, something that would go on enforcing consequences. That too is something the myths understood before we gave it the academic vocabulary. Kronos took power, and power, the myths know better than almost any other subject they address, does not transform the one who holds it. It reveals them. Uranus had kept his monstrous children underground. Kronos looked at what he had inherited and was told by a prophecy. There was always a prophecy. The myths run on prophecy, the way an engine runs on the particular fuel it was built for, that one of his own children would overthrow him. The fates had said it. The fates were not in the habit of saying things they did not mean. So Kronos did the thing that power does. When it encounters a threat it cannot defeat by force. He tried to prevent the future from arriving. Each time his wife Rhea gave birth, Kronos held out his hands, and she gave him the child, and he swallowed it whole. Hestia first, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, and then Poseidon. 5 children, 5 gods, each of them living inside their father's belly in a suspension that was neither death nor life, preserved but imprisoned, full of a growing knowledge of what had been done to them. Rhea was not patient in the way of the defeated. She was patient in the way of the dangerous, which is not resignation at all, but the disciplined management of rage in service of an intention. When her 6th pregnancy reached its end, she went to her parents, to Gaia and the old-bound Uranus, and she asked, "How do I save this one?" They told her where to go. She traveled to Crete, to a deep cave in the eastern side of a mountain, and there she gave birth to the child who would become Zeus. She wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and offered it to Kronos, who was waiting, and Kronos swallowed the stone without slowing down, because certainty makes people careless, and Kronos had always been certain he had the situation managed. The child grew in the cave. The nymph Amalthea nursed him on goat's milk and honey, and the Curetes, young men in armor, clashed their weapons together outside the cave entrance whenever the infant cried, to cover the sound from Kronos, who was not far. Zeus grew strong. He grew into an awareness of his situation and its implications with the particular clarity of someone who has known from early on that they are not safe in the normal way, and when the time was right, he acted. The specifics of how Zeus freed his siblings vary slightly between tellings. In the version that the later tradition settled on most comfortably, he gave Kronos an emetic, a purge, something that forced his father's body to reverse itself, and out of Kronos came the swallowed gods, in reverse order: Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, Hestia, blinking in the sudden extraordinary light of a world that had continued without them. They came out not weakened, but furious, fully formed, ready. The confinement had done nothing to diminish them. If anything, they emerged angrier and more purposeful than they might otherwise have been. Suffering, the myths note without sentimentality, occasionally produces that. The war that followed was called the Titanomachy, and it lasted 10 years, and it shook the physical world in ways that the ancients said were still visible in the geography of the earth. The shattered coastlines, the deep rifts in the land, the places where the mountain rock had an odd, struck quality, as if something enormous had collided with it a very long time ago. On one side, most of the Titans rallied behind Kronos, ancient and enormous, drawing on the deep powers of the first world. On the other, Zeus and his siblings, new to their freedom and outnumbered and still learning what they were capable of. Zeus understood, instinctively, the thing that his father had never grasped, that power needs allies, and that the best allies are those who have a genuine stake in your victory, rather than merely a fear of what happens if they don't comply. He descended into the earth and freed the Cyclopes, whom Kronos had kept bound, as Uranus had bound them before him. They emerged, enormous, blinking, those single great eyes adjusting to light they hadn't seen since before the Titan Maki was a gleam in anyone's mind. And out of gratitude, out of the long forged-up skill of their captivity, they gave Zeus the thunderbolt, a weapon without parallel, a thing that the sky could throw. He freed the Hecatoncheires as well, and those 100-handed giants hurled boulders from the mountaintops at the Titan forces, hundreds at a time, until the sky cracked with the impact, and the seas ran with the turbulence, and the earth itself rang like a struck instrument. 10 years. When the Titans fell, they fell completely. Kronos was bound, sent to the edges of the known world or beneath it, to Tartarus, which the myth describes as so deep that an anvil dropped from the surface would take 9 days to reach the bottom. The elder world was over, or it was called over, which is, as I said, not quite the same thing. The new order required decisions. The world had 3 great kingdoms and 3 sons to rule them. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades stood together, and they drew lots, as if chance were the only fair arbiter of sovereignty, which may be the myth's way of saying that among equals, the only just distribution is one that no one can accuse of favoritism. Zeus drew the sky and the general authority over gods and mortals alike. Poseidon drew the sea, the great middle world, loud and restless and full of possibility. Hades drew the underworld, the third kingdom, the one nobody wanted. Some versions of the myth are careful to say that the earth and Olympus were common territory, shared. Others note that Hades received additional compensation, the greatest wealth of all, since everything mined from the earth is ultimately his. But no accounting quite covers the fact that Hades got the kingdom of the dead, the dark kingdom, the one you rule from a throne that sits in perpetual shadow, attended by shades. He took it. He never complained, in the myths, never argued that the lottery was rigged or that he deserved better. He simply went down and began ruling, that contained silent acceptance, neither grace nor resignation but something more compressed than either, is one of the most interesting things about Hades, and most storytellers breeze past it in their hurry to characterize him as simply sinister. Order was established, then. The sky had its master, the sea had its, the underworld had its, and the Olympian hierarchy assembled itself around Zeus with the complex social architecture of a divine court, marriages and alliances and portfolios of domain, and the endless intricate politics of gods who are essentially immortal and therefore have infinite time to develop grudges. But the world also had loose ends. It always does, when power changes hands. Creatures and beings who predated the new order and hadn't been entirely absorbed or accommodated. Powers whose nature preceded the categories the Olympians were in the business of constructing. And then there were those who existed in the space between the clean columns of the new taxonomy. Not quite divine, not quite mortal, not quite monstrous in the reducible sense. The Sirens were among them, and this is where the story we're really here to tell begins to take its shape. Here is what I need to be honest about from the start: the origin stories of the Sirens' conflict. The ancient sources do not agree, and I am not going to perform a false consensus, because the disagreements are themselves part of what makes the figure interesting. Mythology is not a fact database. It is a living body of interpretation, and the places where it disagrees with itself are often the places where the culture that produced it was working through something genuinely unresolved. The oldest available version, or one of the oldest, makes the Sirens daughters of Achilles, the great river god, the spirit of the most important freshwater river in Greece, and one of the Muses. The identity of the Muse varies. Terpsichore, the muse of dance and choral song, in some texts. Melpomene, the muse of tragedy, in others. Both of these parentages are available in ancient sources, and I find myself unable to simply pick one and discard the other, because each one says something true about the Sirens that the other doesn't quite reach. If your mother is Terpsichore, then movement is in your nature, and music is your inheritance, and what you eventually do, sitting on rocks and singing until men stop rowing, is a kind of performance taken to its furthest possible conclusion, a dance with no other partners, an art that has turned inward and become consuming. If your mother is Melpomene, then the story you tell is always a story about loss, and the loss that accumulates around you on those rocks is not incidental to your nature, but intrinsic to it, as if the genre of your existence is tragedy, and you have no authorial control over that. The other origin, the one that came through Ovid, which means it arrived late, filtered through the Roman tradition's particular habits of moralization and rationalization, is the one that I keep returning to, because it gives the Sirens a before. It gives them a life prior to the rocks and the singing, a context in which their strangeness is not original but acquired, a grief they did not choose. In this version, the Sirens were girls, companions of Persephone, daughters of various minor divinities, young, unremarkable in any specific way, except that they were close to the daughter of Demeter in the way that close friends are close, meaning that each of them knew the particular texture of the other's presence, the specific sound of the other's voice, the way she laughed, and what she looked like in the afternoon light. They were playing in a meadow in Sicily on a day that had no special weather, no omen visible in the clouds, no premonitory stillness in the air. Persephone was picking flowers. The detail always matters. She was picking flowers, which is an image of ordinary girlhood, of the small pleasures of a world that is still intact. And then Hades arrived. He came up through a fissure in the earth that opened at his approach. The ground simply unmade itself for him, because he was its lord and the earth obeyed him. He arrived in a dark chariot, drawn by dark horses, and he took Persephone, and the earth closed behind them, and the flowers she had been holding fell, and the meadow continued to exist, which is one of the strangest details in the myth, the ordinary world going on without the person who had just been removed from it. The girls who had been playing beside her were left standing in the empty meadow. They heard her cry out. They heard the cry cut off as the ground sealed. They ran. They screamed her name. They looked for any opening in the earth, any sign of which direction she had gone, any way to follow. There was nothing. The ground was ground again, impassive and closed, offering no information. And then they did the thing that people do when the ordinary mechanisms of help have failed completely. They asked for something extraordinary. In Ovid's telling, they asked the gods for wings, specifically to be able to search across the surface of the sea as well as the land, to be able to go everywhere at once, to not be bounded by what ordinary bodies could cover. The wings were granted. The transformation came, feathers and flight, and the altered body that now carried a girl's face and voice inside a bird's frame. They flew. They looked everywhere. They called Persephone's name across the islands of the Aegean and the Adriatic and the waters of the Western Sea. They called across the straits and over the high points of coastlines. They searched for a very long time. They never found her. What happened to Persephone, of course, was eventually resolved in the way that things are resolved when Zeus decides to stop ignoring a problem, through negotiation, through the complex diplomacy of divine politics, through the compromise that gave Persephone part of the year above and part below, that made the seasons the visible record of a mother's grief. But the Sirens were searching during the negotiation. They were not present when the settlement was reached. No one thought to tell them. No herald was dispatched to the rocky islands, where the winged women were still calling, still waiting for an answer. And the voices that had been raised to search, to call across open water, to project human need into the indifferent air above the sea, those voices stayed. They kept their quality of searching, of calling out for something that might hear and respond. They kept the urgency and the longing and the particular pitch of someone who has not given up, who is still expecting an answer, even when the expectation has been unfulfilled for so long that it has become the entire shape of a life. Only the object of the calling changed, or perhaps it did not change as deliberately as that. Perhaps the voices simply continued calling, and the men who sailed within hearing range heard in those voices the particular frequency that finds the thing they are each personally missing, the home they are returning to, the certainty they have been unable to locate, the feeling of being completely known, the one experience of beauty so complete that it asked nothing of them, and the voice that was searching for Persephone found, without intending to, the resonant frequency of human longing. The ship stopped. The men leaned over the sides. The flowers grew on the islands around the bones of those who stayed too long. The sirens kept singing. Whether the myth intends this as monstrous or tragic is a question it seems deliberately unwilling to resolve, which I take to be a kind of intellectual honesty rather than evasion. A grief that kills others is still a grief that is genuinely hard to hold, and the myth does not look away from the difficulty. Now I want to talk about the heroes, the figures whose stories intersect with the sirens directly, or whose existence casts light on what the sirens represent. There are 4 I want to stay with, and I want to stay with all of them at length, because each one of them approaches the same problem. The problem of beauty that destroys, of the thing you want that will kill you, from a completely different angle, and the difference between the angles is where the real meaning lives. The first is Orpheus, and his story does not intersect with the sirens on their actual rocks. It intersects with what they stand for, the power of music over the will, the question of whether art can do anything against the pull of the void. His is a story I think about more than I strictly need to, and I haven't entirely worked out why, but I have decided to include it here anyway and let it mean whatever it means. Orpheus was born in Thrace. Thrace, in the Greek geographical imagination, occupied a particular kind of cultural edge, a place that was Greek enough to be part of the story, but wild enough to be different. The North Wind country, the place where Dionysius was also said to originate, where the ordinary rules of the civilized South were somewhat loosened. His father in most versions was the river god Oeagrus, though some sources say it was Apollo himself, and the ambiguity is probably not accidental. The myth may be saying, in the indirect way that myths often say things, that Orpheus was so unusually gifted that a divine origin is the only satisfying explanation. His mother was Calliope, the chief of the 9 Muses, the muse whose domain is epic poetry, the long, sustained narration that lasts, the kind of story that outlives the people in it. Her gift to her son was not merely musical skill in the technical sense. It was something prior to technique, a capacity for expression that operated on a different register than anything that can be taught. When Orpheus played the lyre, the world became slightly permeable. Animals stopped what they were doing and turned toward him. Trees leaned, rivers slowed their current, actually slowed, as if the music had given the water something better to do. Stones moved. I know how that sounds. The stones moved. He grew up under Apollo's instruction or Apollo's influence. The details vary, but the connection to the god of music and light is constant, and he developed into something the Greek world had no clean category for. Not a god, not a mortal exactly, but a figure who could operate at the boundary between what is living and what is not, between the ordered surface of the world and the deep currents underneath it. Music was his medium, and he used it the way a good swimmer uses water, as the element he was made for, the thing he moved through with a fluency that others could only watch. He sailed with the Argonauts. Jason assembled the greatest crew in Greek myth. Heracles was there at the beginning, and Castor and Pollux, and Peleus, who would become the father of Achilles, and Atalanta, and 6 others of legendary ability. And when Jason considered who else to include, he thought about the route ahead, and he thought about what the route required, and he invited Orpheus. When the Argo approached the waters near the Sirens' islands, and the route to Colchis required passing through those waters, there was no alternative geography. The crew first heard nothing. The sea was still in that particular wrong way, the stillness that experienced sailors learn to distrust. And then the singing began, and it came from everywhere at once, from the rocks to the left and the rocks ahead, and from some quality of the air itself, and the Argonauts began to slow. They didn't know they were slowing. That is the first insidious thing about it. The men who heard the sirens didn't experience it as being pulled towards something dangerous. They experienced it as finally being in the right place. The rowing became less urgent because arrival was no longer a goal when arrival felt, somehow, already accomplished. The oars dipped and didn't quite bite the water with their previous intention, and the faces of the crew took on the expression of people listening to something they have been trying to remember for a very long time. Orpheus picked up his lyre. He played, and the thing that the myth does carefully and correctly here is, it doesn't stage this as a contest. The sirens' singing did not stop. Orpheus did not overpower them. What he did was offer something else to attend to. He put his music alongside theirs in the air, and the double layer gave the crew a choice their ears could navigate, even if they didn't consciously know they were choosing. His music spoke of things the sirens' music couldn't reach, the specific texture of home, not the generic promise of belonging, but the actual remembered specifics of where they were going, who was waiting, what it would feel like to be on land again. He sang about Iolcos and Mycenae and the individual harbors each man had left behind. He made the abstract homecoming concrete in exactly the way the sirens made the abstract danger beautiful. One man jumped anyway, a man named Butes from Athens, who was apparently constitutionally unable to resist. He went over the side and swam toward the rocks, and Aphrodite, who was watching, or who happened to be present, or who intervened because she was moved by something in his wanting, pulled him from the water and carried him to safety in Sicily. One line in the myth. One line for a man who couldn't stop himself from going toward the song, even with Orpheus playing 3 feet away. The Argo sailed on. Orpheus continued to play until the islands were behind them, until the singing was a memory of itself rather than a present sound. And then he lowered the lyre and said nothing, and the Argonauts rowed in silence for a while, and none of them, probably, ever talked about what they had almost done. Later, much later, after the fleece had been won, and the long, complicated return journey had ended, and all the other violence and magic and grief of that voyage had resolved itself into wherever such things resolve, Orpheus went home to Thrace and married Eurydice. I don't know very much about the period between the return of the Argonauts and the wedding, and neither, really, does the tradition. Those years are compressed into a few sentences. They were married, they were happy. This is stated with the confidence of someone setting up a contrast. On or near their wedding day, Eurydice was walking in a meadow. Again a meadow. Again the ordinary world in the moment before it stops being ordinary. And she was bitten by a snake, and she died. Orpheus did not accept this. The word accept is probably not quite right. He did not organize himself around the fact the way that grief eventually organizes people, incorporating the loss into the architecture of a continuing life. He refused the architecture. He went to the underworld. He descended through the cave at Tyneron, the entrance that the living use when they have cause to go below, and he walked into the dark with his lyre, and he played as he walked. The shades who heard him gathered, drawn by a sound that their world had never contained before. The Furies, who punish relentlessly, who have never been recorded as weeping, wept. Tantalus, who reaches forever for water and fruit that always retreats, forgot to reach for a moment. Sisyphus sat down on his boulder. The whole underworld went still, in the particular way it goes still when something happens that it has no precedent for. Orpheus came before Hades and Persephone, and he played for them, and he sang. And what he sang was the truth, that he had come for his wife, that he could not be where she was not, that love had compelled him to this place that the living are not supposed to be able to reach. He did not argue that Eurydice's death was unjust. He did not try to negotiate from a position of principle. He simply played, and the playing said, "This is what I am. This is what I feel. This is the size of what her loss is." Persephone wept. Hades consented. Eurydice was summoned from wherever new shades go in the first days of their death, and Orpheus was told the condition: walk back toward the light. She will follow. Do not look back until you are both fully in the living world, not before. He walked. The ascent from the underworld is long. The passage is dark. There is no sound from behind him, and the underworld is perfectly silent, the silence that exists in a place where breath is no longer a constant event. He walked, and he heard nothing from behind him, and the nothing accumulated, step after step, into a doubt that had a very particular texture. Not the fear that she wasn't there, but the fear that the silence meant something was wrong, that she had been taken again, that the bargain was being broken in some way he couldn't see. He could have kept walking. He was almost there. The light was visible, the grey of the upper passages, the beginning of ordinary air. Almost. He turned. She was there. For a fraction of a second, she was there, and her eyes met his, and then the rule was violated, and something in the underworld's mechanics reasserted itself, and she was pulled back into the dark. She said his name, or she didn't. Different versions of the myth say different things about whether she spoke, but she went, and he watched her go, and then he stood in the passage alone, with the light behind him and the dark in front of him, and whatever he felt in that moment is something I am not sure language at any level of sophistication actually reaches. He came out. He tried to go back, and the boatman Charon refused him. A mortal is permitted the crossing once in grief, not twice in stubbornness. He sat on the banks of the river for 7 days without eating, singing. He eventually went back to Thrace, and he wandered, and he played, and he refused the company of women. This detail is noted in the texts with an odd compressed brevity, as if the scribes knew it was significant and were uncertain what to do with it. And eventually the Maenads, the women who followed Dionysius in their ecstatic rites, tore him apart on a hillside. They scattered the pieces. His head floated down the river Hebrus, still intact, still, in some versions, still singing. It came to rest eventually on the island of Lesbos, where it became an oracle, speaking prophecy from the riverbank. I have never known what to do with the singing head. I include it because leaving it out feels like a lie by omission. What Orpheus's story says in conversation with the siren story is something like this. Music is the closest thing the world has to a force that can operate across the boundary between living and dead. Orpheus's music and the sirens singing are, in some sense, the same kind of thing. They reach places that other forms of communication cannot reach. They bypass the rational defenses. They find the thing that is privately most important to the listener and address it directly. The difference is in what they are in service of. The siren's singing is in service of grief that has turned inward and become consuming. Orpheus's music is in service of love that refuses to accept the standard terms of loss. Both are devastating. Both involve the singer being unable to stop. Both, in the end, lead to destruction. The sirens destroyed by the one man who heard them and kept rowing. Orpheus destroyed by the one turn of his head. The second hero I want to talk about is Jason, and I am going to try not to rush through him the way the tradition tends to. Jason was raised by Chiron, the wise centaur, on the slopes of Mount Pelion. Chiron was the educator of heroes. Achilles was also his student, and in some versions, Asclepius, the god of medicine, and various others who needed their raw capability shaped into something usable. What Chiron taught was not merely combat technique, though that was part of it. He taught hunting and music and medicine and, underlying all of it, something like ethics, the particular ethics of the hero, which in the Greek understanding meant proportion, the willingness to ask what a situation actually required and bring exactly that to bear on it, rather than always deploying maximum force because maximum force was available. Jason's claim to the throne of Iolcos was legitimate, but had been preempted by his uncle Peleus, who had usurped the kingship while Jason's father Aeson was still living. Jason arrived at Iolcos as a young man, having lost a sandal crossing a river, which fulfilled a prophecy that Peleus had been dreading, because the oracle had told him to fear a man with one sandal, and he presented himself at court and stated his claim. Peleus, managing his fear with the smile of someone who has already decided what he is going to do, offered to hand over the kingdom if Jason would retrieve the golden fleece from Colchis at the far end of the world, a task that every reasonable person understood to be impossible. Jason did not argue that the task was impossible. He went and assembled the Argo and the Argonauts, and he set out. He was not the most impressive individual aboard his own ship. Heracles was stronger. Castor and Pollux were better fighters. Atalanta was faster. The Dioscuri had divine blood. But Jason was the one who had organized this. He was the one who understood that the task required not just one exceptional person, but a team of exceptional people, each contributing what they were specifically best at, and he was the one who could hold that team together long enough for it to accomplish something. That is its own kind of ability, and it does not make the highlight reel as easily as strength or speed. which is why Jason gets a somewhat diminished reputation in the popular retelling of myths that prefer their heroes to be unambiguously powerful. The Sirens were, for Jason, a problem he navigated by being smart enough to have brought someone who could handle it. He had brought Orpheus specifically because he knew the route passed through those waters. He had planned for this particular danger, and when the crisis came, Orpheus did what Orpheus was there to do, and the ship passed through. That is not nothing. That is, in some ways, the purest form of heroic intelligence, knowing what you are and what you are not, knowing what the road ahead requires, and making sure you have it with you before you leave. Jason could not have played the Sirens to safety himself. He knew he couldn't. He planned accordingly, weeks or months before the moment arrived, when the thinking was still clear and the stakes were not yet present. The third figure is Circe. I feel the familiar guilt about spending less time with her than she deserves. The guilt I mentioned at the start. The awareness that the tradition has consistently treated her as a supporting character in a story that is, in many ways, more authentically hers than Odysseus's. But I will try to do better than usual. Circe was the daughter of Helios, the sun, and the Oceanid Perse. Her brother was Aeetes, king of Colchis, keeper of the fleece. Her niece was Medea. Her aunt, in some versions, was Hecate, the goddess of magic and thresholds and the night. She lived on the island of Aegean, the island that is everywhere and nowhere, that appears on the maps of the mythological Mediterranean in different places depending on which text you're reading, as if the geography itself is unstable around her presence. What she had was power. The Greek texts call her a pharmakis, which means someone who works with drugs and herbs and potions, but the word carries more than pharmacy in the modern sense. It includes magic, transformation, the knowledge of what things actually are beneath their surfaces. She knew how to unmake things and remake them. She turned Odysseus's crew into pigs when they arrived on her island, which is the version of her everyone knows. What the version that everyone knows often omits is that she turned them back when Odysseus confronted her, that she hosted them for a year, that she became something more complicated than a villain over the course of that year, that when Odysseus finally said he needed to continue home, she told him how. She told him everything he would face. The Sirens first, then the clashing rocks, or, in the version the Odyssey follows, the narrow strait between Scylla and Charybdis. She knew the route. She had been in those waters, or she understood those waters in the way that old power understands old power, with a recognition that bypasses the need for direct experience. She gave Odysseus specific, practical instructions. She told him to put wax in his crew's ears, beeswax softened in his hands, enough to block the sound completely. And then she said, "But if you yourself want to hear it," this is where I want to pause on Circe for a moment, because I think the question she implies here is more important than it is usually given credit for being. She does not tell Odysseus he should hear it. She does not tell him he should not hear it. She tells him, if you want to hear it. She identifies his wanting before he has said anything about wanting. She knows he will want to, and then she tells him how to do it safely, which is the thing a genuinely powerful figure does, when they care about what happens to the people who come to them for help. Not prohibition, not protection through ignorance, but information sufficient to make an informed choice. Odysseus chose to hear, and Circe knew he would, and she gave him the means to survive it. And then she sent him back to his ship. The fourth hero is Odysseus himself, and the story of his encounter with the Sirens is the one the tradition has preserved most completely, which means it is also the one that has been most handled, most polished, the most difficult to see clearly through all the interpretation that has accumulated on its surface. He was born on Ithaca, the small island, the rocky one, the one that is not the most beautiful island in the Ionian Sea, nor the most prosperous, nor the most strategically important. Ithaca is notable for being where Odysseus came from, which is to say, its notability is derived entirely from him, which is something he probably knew, and which probably informed the particular intensity with which he wanted to return to it. His grandfather, on his mother's side, was Autolycus, who was either the son of Hermes or simply the most accomplished thief and liar in the Greek world, with the divine association a way of honoring the scale of his gifts. Autolycus gave Odysseus his name, which in the Greek means something like the one who causes pain, or the one who gives and receives pain, depending on how you pass the verb. And there is a version of the story in which Autolycus chose this name as a kind of protection, a name that announces difficulty so that the world knows what to expect, that names the hardship rather than pretending it away. He grew up. He wanted very specifically not to go to Troy. The historical sources, the ones that preserve the stories that didn't make it into the canonical epics, describe the elaborate madness performance, the ploughing of fields with salt, the ox harnessed with a donkey, and then his infant son was placed in front of the plough, and he stopped, and the performance was over, and he went. 10 years of war. He did not distinguish himself at Troy in the way Achilles distinguished himself, in pure martial excellence, in the burning individual glory of the great fighter. He distinguished himself laterally, in the negotiations and the strategies and the ideas that no one else had thought of yet. The wooden horse. Everyone knows the wooden horse. It worked because it was so fundamentally strange that the Trojans couldn't process it through the normal defensive frameworks, and that is the signature of an Odysseus solution. It works at an oblique angle to expectation. Troy fell. The Greeks sailed home. Most of them made it reasonably quickly. Odysseus did not. He had blinded the Cyclops Polyphemus, who was the son of Poseidon, and Poseidon's sustained displeasure was, in the mythological world, a maritime fact. The sea god controlled the sea, and the sea, when Poseidon wanted a man not to reach shore, provided conditions that made reaching shore very difficult. By the time of the Sirens, Odysseus had already endured the Cyclops and the Bag of Winds and the Laestrygonian giants and Circe's year. He had already descended to the underworld and spoken with the dead, with Tiresias, who told him the shape of what was coming, with Achilles, who told him something about glory that Odysseus listened to carefully without necessarily changing course, with his own mother, Anticlea, who had died of grief at his absence, and whose shade reached toward him and could not be held because the dead are incorporeal, and reaching back is all you can do. He came back up. He went back to Circe. She fed his crew, and she told him what was ahead, and he listened to all of it with the quality of attention that is a skill, a developed and deliberate thing, not merely the passive reception of information, but the active assessment of what is being said and what it implies and what it requires. The night before they would pass the Sirens' islands, he told his crew. He told them most of it, the wax, the procedure, the requirement to keep rowing regardless of what happened. He told them to lash him to the mast, and he told them what to do if he signaled to be released. He did not tell them why he was doing it this way, why he wasn't simply using the wax along with everyone else. Perhaps he didn't fully know himself why. Perhaps knowing was the thing he needed more than safety. Perhaps Odysseus, without the need to know, would not be Odysseus. In the morning, the wind died. The sea around those islands always went still first. It was the first symptom, the calm before the sound, and experienced sailors who had heard the stories would feel the hairs on the backs of their arms respond to it and would know that something was coming. The crew rowed in the absence of wind, their oars dipping into the grey-green glass of a sea that had decided not to cooperate, and the island began to take shape ahead, and then they heard it. Some of the crew heard it as something distant and perhaps not entirely real, a sound that might be wind through rocks, might be the particular acoustic property of this stretch of coastline. The wax was already in their ears. They heard it the way you hear music from another room, there but not there, insistent without being intelligible. They kept rowing. Odysseus heard it fully. The Sirens called him by name. This is in the text. They called Odysseus, great Odysseus, come here, come to us. They said they knew him. They said they knew the work he had done at Troy, and they could tell him all that passes on the wide earth. That specific promise, all that passes on the wide earth, is not a promise of pleasure. It is a promise of knowledge, and knowing this about Odysseus, they named the exact thing that he could not turn away from. He strained against the ropes. He thrashed. The rope cut into his wrists and into his chest, and he did not care. His eyes were fixed on the rocks and on whatever was visible on them, and his face, his crew, watching him because someone had to watch him, watching with the expressions of people who are frightened in a way they cannot articulate. His face was doing something they had no name for. He signaled with his eyebrows to be released. The specific Greek detail. He signaled with his eyebrows, and his crew watched his eyebrows move and understood the message and responded by adding more rope. They were good men. They had made a promise to a man who had thought more clearly a day earlier than he was capable of thinking right now, and they kept the promise even against the evidence of his current will. There is something in that, a form of loyalty that goes deeper than compliance with what someone wants in the moment, that honors the terms of what was established when clearer conditions prevailed. They kept adding rope. The islands fell behind. The singing began to thin, to lose its spatial immediacy, to become a texture in the air rather than a presence in the ear. Odysseus slumped against the mast. He kept his eyes on the rocks until they were no longer visible. And then he was released, and the text does not record what he said, and I suspect that's because he didn't say anything, or because what he said was something that couldn't be written down, or because the scribes had the wisdom to know that silence after certain experiences is its own accurate record. Later, not much later in the text, but it always feels like later, like the story draws a breath before going on. The ships navigated past Scylla and Charybdis, and men were lost there, and Odysseus could not save them. And that grief was a different kind of grief from the grief of the Sirens, more immediate and less possible to examine at a distance. He eventually got home. That is not a spoiler. It is announced in the first line of the poem. Now, the Sirens themselves, after Odysseus sailed past. The tradition says they cast themselves into the sea. They drowned, or they ceased, the way things cease when the condition that maintains their existence is removed. The prophecy had been, in some versions, quite specific. Any man who heard their song and survived would end them. Odysseus had heard their song. He had survived. The condition was met. This is the detail I find most impossible to walk past. The Sirens were not defeated by force. They were not outsung or outfought or destroyed by divine intervention. They were destroyed by an exception to the pattern, by a man who heard them and still left. And whatever they were, whatever combination of grief and transformation and ancient music had become their existence, whatever they were, it could not survive the existence of one person who had heard them fully and chosen not to come. There is something in that which I turn over in my mind more than is probably productive. The thing that destroys certain forces is not opposition, but indifference. Or not even indifference, because Odysseus was not indifferent. He heard them. He wanted desperately what they offered. He was simply unable to act on that wanting, which is not indifference at all. It's something harder. It's the experience of wanting fully and choosing differently. Let me collect the thread here. What I've been building toward is a reading of the siren myth that is not simply about the danger of beauty. The danger of beauty is the part the tradition has preserved most faithfully, and it is real, but it is not the whole thing. The whole thing has several layers, and they don't all point in the same direction. The first layer is cosmological. The Sirens belong to a world that precedes the Olympian order, a world in which transformation was not metaphorical, in which grief could change your body, in which music was not an art form, but a force. They exist at the boundary between the old world and the new one, and their tragedy, if it is a tragedy, is that they continued to exist as the world changed around them without accommodating them. The second layer is about the nature of the voice, what it means to have a voice that cannot be separated from grief, that has been shaped by loss into something compelling and devastating, that finds resonance in the loss of whoever hears it. The Sirens' music works because it is not invented. It addresses something real in the listener, something that the listener is genuinely missing. The danger comes not from the music being false, but from the music being too accurate. The third layer is about desire and survival. The two things are not automatically compatible, but wanting something does not make it safe to pursue. Knowing something is dangerous does not make the wanting go away. The siren story is one of the oldest human encodings of this fact, and the encoding is careful. It does not say that the wanting is wrong, or that the men who were destroyed by it were weak or foolish. It says, the sea around those islands was littered with the remnants of those who were not able to hold the contradiction that Odysseus held. The Greek world knew, before the theory existed to articulate it, that desire and knowledge are often in conflict, that the thing you most want to know may be the thing most likely to undo you. Odysseus's solution, hearing it from the position of the mast, is the myth's attempt to imagine a situation in which both can coexist, in which the wanting is honored and the survival is maintained. It is an extraordinarily specific and unlikely solution, and the myth knows it. The construction required preparation, required help, required two separate kinds of intelligence operating in sequence. It is not a solution that scales. It is not a general principle. It is a specific man in a specific situation finding a way through. Anyway, the afterlife of the siren in Western imagination is long and strange and full of transformations that tell you almost as much about the cultures that inherited her as they do about the Greek original. The most significant physical transformation was the one that happened somewhere in the medieval period. The shift from the bird woman of the Greek tradition to the fish woman of the mermaid. When it happened exactly is difficult to pin down. There are transitional images in late Roman and Byzantine art where the siren seems to be changing form even within a single composition, as if the symbol were in the process of migrating between one body and another. By the high medieval period, the mermaid siren was standard in the bestiaries, seated on rocks in northern waters, her fishtail curling beneath her, combing her hair with one hand and holding a mirror with the other. The mirror is a late addition to the image, and it is interesting. In the Greek version, the sirens have nothing so reflective or self-aware. They are simply there, singing, without any implication that they know how they appear to the sailors. The medieval mirror introduces a self-consciousness, a vanity narrative that converts the Greek grief into something more morally legible. Here is a creature who knows she is beautiful and uses it deliberately. This is not more accurate, it is more manageable. It gives the danger an agent and an intention, which makes it feel less like a force of nature and more like a moral choice, which is easier to warn against. The bestiary tradition surrounded the image with explicit Christian allegory. The siren is worldly temptation, the pleasures of the flesh, the sensory experience that distracts from the spiritual path. Odysseus becomes a figure of the Christian soul navigating temptation. His crew's wax becomes the avoidance of sinful entertainment. His own bound hearing becomes, oddly, interestingly, a kind of contemplative position, the capacity to be present to the danger without being moved by it, which is not exactly what Homer was describing, but which the medieval interpreters found useful. The Renaissance complicated this picture. as the Renaissance complicated most things by being genuinely uncertain whether the sirens were metaphors for sin or for something more interesting, the power of art to operate below the level of reason, to move the listener before the listener has had time to evaluate what is moving them. This is a more honest account of what music actually does, and several Renaissance writers engaged with it as such. The sirens as a figure not for mere temptation, but for aesthetic experience at its most extreme, the edge of the continent where beauty becomes vertiginous. There is something that feels almost like a modern sensibility in that reading, something that approaches the surface of the water and then pulls back, because the analogy that almost forms in my mind about addiction, about the way certain craving states operate in the brain, the way the wanting and the harming are processed in the same channel, that analogy feels both right and slightly wrong, like a comparison that maps the territory but uses a scale that is off by some factor I can't. I am going to leave it there. I noted I was going there, and then I pulled back, and that is probably correct. The Romantic era was more willing to entertain the siren's perspective, or at least to complicate the heroic one. If Odysseus represents the ordered, rational, forward-moving self, home-seeking, identity-preserving, the man who wants to return to what he was before the war, then the sirens represent something the Romantics found increasingly interesting: the pull toward dissolution, toward the kind of experience that would cost you yourself and might be worth it. The Romantics were not sure that Ithaca was worth getting back to. They were not sure that a self you had to lash to a mast to preserve was a self worth preserving. This is the reading I find most historically interesting and personally most uncomfortable, because it is not wrong exactly. There is something real in the Romantic intuition about the limits of the self-preserving self, but it romanticizes the deaths of the sailors in a way that the Greek myth is careful not to. The sailors who died on those rocks did not go there in service of an aesthetic philosophy. They went there because they couldn't stop. The distinction between a death chosen in pursuit of transcendence and a death that happens because you couldn't help it is one that the Romantic reading tends to blur in a way I find dishonest. The sirens, in the Greek, are not inviting the sailors toward transcendence. They are calling out of grief, and the sailors are caught in a frequency they have no protection against. The beauty is real. The destruction is real. The beauty does not make the destruction meaningful. That is harder to hold than the Romantic version, but I think it is the version the myth actually intends. The world we have built in the centuries since has tried, in various ways, to make the siren story into a parable about specific dangers: the dangers of bad art, of pleasure, of addiction, of social media, of the internet, of whatever the current threatening medium is. These readings are not useless. There is something in the siren myth that genuinely speaks to the experience of being caught in a loop you can't stop, of returning again and again to something you know is not good for you, because the pull is stronger than the knowledge. But the myth is older than all the specific manifestations it's been applied to, and it speaks to something prior: the simple fact that the world contains experiences of beauty that are also experiences of danger. and that the human capacity for desire is not calibrated to distinguish between them. We want the song. That wanting is real, and it is not a character defect, and it does not go away when we understand what it costs. The question the myth poses, the one I have been circling around for this entire telling, is not how do we stop wanting dangerous things. The myth is not interested in that question, because the myth already knows the answer is that we don't. The question is, what do we build around ourselves before we are close enough to the rocks to hear the singing that allows us to keep going? Odysseus's ropes. The answer is Odysseus's ropes. Not the avoidance of the experience, not the dulling of the hearing, not the pretense that the song is not beautiful, but the prior decision made in the clear light of a morning when the music is still far away, to construct the conditions under which going toward it and surviving it can coexist. That is a very old answer to a very old question, and it has not been superseded. We still, 3,000 years later, spend enormous amounts of effort figuring out what our particular ropes need to be, what structures to build around ourselves before we get too close to the things that call to us in the wrong key. The specific technologies change. The specific dangers change. The fundamental problem does not change. The sirens knew your name. They always know your name. That is the part of the myth that is not metaphorical. The bones on the rocks have been gone for a long time. The rocks are still there, or their equivalents are, in various waters. The sea is still doing what the sea does, which is moving constantly and ignoring everything you feel about it. The story ends, as I said, with the sirens falling into the water after Odysseus's ship passes out of sight. In some versions they simply cease. In some versions they transform again into something that swims, that carries the grief into a different medium. In some versions the islands go quiet, and passing sailors for generations afterward noted the unusual quality of the silence in that stretch of water. Not the comfortable silence of open sea, but a silence that was slightly wrong, slightly aware of itself. The silence of a place where something used to happen. The voice that searched for Persephone and never found her went somewhere. Voices don't simply disappear. They change form and continue, the way all things change form and continue, the way the myth itself has changed form continuously for 3,000 years and continues now, in a story told in the dark to someone who has already started to drift. You are starting to drift. That is good. That is exactly what this is for. The sea outside your window, or the sea that isn't outside your window, the sea at whatever distance your particular geography places it, is doing what it always does. The water moves. The old rocks are out there. The light on the water in the morning will be different from the light right now, which is dark, which is the particular rich dark of a night that is going somewhere restful. Let the story settle where it lands. The sirens sang. The world went still. One man heard them fully and held on, and held on, and held on until the music was behind him. The sirens fell into the water. The ship sailed on. Ithaca was eventually there. The harbor, the hill, the house where someone had been waiting 20 years. The loom where the weaving and the unweaving had kept the space open, day after day, the quiet act of maintaining a place for someone who might still be coming. He came, she was there, the ropes had held. Good night, rest now, the mast will hold. You are safe here, in the dark, in the still water.